Section 19 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 10, Part 1. John Tyndall. In my little book on Faraday, published in 1868, I have stated that he had but to will it to raise his income in 1832 to £5,000 a year. In 1836 the sum might have doubled. Yet this son of a blacksmith, this journeyman bookbinder, with his proud, sensitive soul, rejecting the splendid opportunities open to him, refusing even to think them splendid in presence of higher aims, cheerfully accepted it from the Trinity House a pittance of £200 a year. John Tyndall. Tyndall was of high descent and lowly birth. His father was a member of the Irish constabulary, and there were intervals when the boy's mother took in washing. But back of this the constable swore a faith, when the ale was right, that he was descended from an Irish king, and probably this is true, for most Irishmen are, and acknowledge it themselves. The father of our Tyndall spelled his name Tyndale, and traced a direct relationship to William Tyndale, who declared he would place a copy of the English Bible in the hands of every plowboy in the British Isles, and pretty nearly made good his vow. William Tyndale paid for his privileges, however. He was arrested, given an opportunity to run away, but wouldn't. Then he was exiled. Finally, he was incarcerated in a dungeon of the Castle Vilvoorden. His cell was beneath the level of the ground, so it was cold and damp and dark. He petitioned the governor of the prison for a coat to keep him warm, and a candle by which he could read. "We'll give you both light and heat pretty soon," was the reply. And they did. They led Tyndale out under the blue sky and tied him to a stake set in the ground. Around his feet they piled brush, and also all of his books and papers that they could find. A chain was put around his neck and hooked tight to the post. Then the faggots were piled high, and the fire was lighted. "He was not burned to death," argued one of the priests who was present. "He was not burned to death. He just drew up his feet and hanged himself in the chain, and so was choked. He was that stubborn." The father of John Tyndall was an Orangeman, and had in a glass case a bit of the flag carried at the Battle of the Boyne. It is believed with reason that the original flag had in it about 10,000 square yards of material. Tyndale the Orangeman was of so uncompromising a type that he occasionally arrested Catholics on general principles, like the Irishman who beat the Jew under the mistaken idea that he had something to do with crucifying our Savior. "But that was 2,000 years ago," protested the Jew. "Never mind, I just heard of it. Take that, and that." Zeal not wisely directed is a true Irish trait. It will not do to say that the Irish have a monopoly on stupidity, yet there have been times when I thought they nearly cornered the market. I had once charge of a gang of green Irishmen at a lumber camp. I started a night school for their benefit, as their schooling had stopped at subtraction. One evening they got it into their heads that I was an atheist. Things began to come my way. I concluded discretion was the better part of valor, and so took to the woods, literally. They followed me for a mile, and then gave up the chase. On the way home they met a man who spoke ill of me, and they fell upon him and nearly pounded his life out. I never had to lick any of my gang; they looked after this themselves. On pay nights they all got drunk and fell upon each other. Broken noses and black eyes were quite popular. Father Driscoll used to come around nearly every month and have them all sign the pledge. That story about the Irishman who ate the rind of the watermelon and threw the inside away is true. That is just what the Irish do. Very often they are not able to distinguish good from bad, kindness from wrong, love from hate. Ireland has all the freedom she can use or deserves, just as we all have. What would Ireland do with freedom if she had it? Hate for England keeps peace at home. Home rule would mean home roughhouse, and a most beautiful argument it would be, enforced with shillelagh logic. The spirit of Donnybrook Fair is there today as much as ever, and wherever you see a head, hit it, would be home rule. Donnybrook is a condition of mind. If England really had a grudge against Ireland and wanted to get even, she could not do better than to set her adrift. But then the Irish impulsiveness sometimes leads to good, else how could we account for such men as O'Connor, Parnell, John Tyndall, Burke, Goldsmith, Sheridan, Arthur Wellesley, and all the other Irish poets, orators, and thinkers who have made us vibrate with our kind. Transplanted weeds produce our finest flowers. The parents of Tyndall were intent on giving their boy an education, and to them the act of committing things to memory was education. William Tyndale gave the Bible to the people. John Tyndall would force it upon them. The Book of Martyrs, the sermons of Jeremy Taylor, and the Bible little John came to know by heart, and he grew to have a fine distaste for all. Once, when nearly a man grown, he had the temerity to argue with his father that the Bible might be better appreciated if a bounty were not placed in disbelief in its divine origin. A cuff on the ear was the answer, and John was given until sundown to apologize. He did not apologize. And young Tyndale then vowed he would change his name to Tyndall and forever separate himself from a person whose religion was so largely mixed with brutality. But yet John Tyndale was not a bad man. He had intellect far above the average of his neighbors. He had the courage of his convictions. His son had the courage of his lack of convictions. And the early drilling in the Bible was a good thing for young Tyndall. Bible legend and allusion color the English language, and any man who does not know his Bible well can never hope to speak or write English with grace and fluency. Tyndall always knew and acknowledged his indebtedness to his parents, and he also knew that his salvation depended on getting away from and beyond the narrow confines of their beliefs and habits. Because a thing helps you in a certain period of your education is no reason why you should feed on it forevermore. This way lies arrested development. Life, like heat, is a mode of motion, and progress consists in discarding a good thing as soon as you've found a better. Occasionally Herbert Spencer used to spend a Sunday afternoon with the Carlyles at their modest home in Chelsea. At such time Jeanie Welsh would usually manage to pilot the conversational craft along smooth waters, but if she were not present hot arguments would follow, and finally a point would be reached where Carlyle and Spencer would simply sit and glare at each other. After such scenes, I've always thought less of two persons, Carlyle and myself, said Spencer, and so for many years I very cautiously avoided Cheyne Row. Then there was another man Spencer avoided, although for a different reason. This individual was John Tyndall. On the death of Tyndall, Spencer wrote, "There has just died the greatest teacher of modern times, a man who stimulated thought in old and young, everyone he met, as no one else I knew ever did. Once we went together for a much needed rest in the Lake District. Gossip, which has its advantages in that it can be carried on with no tax on one's intellectual powers, had no part in our conversation. The discussion of great themes began at once, wherever Tyndall was. The atmosphere of the man was intensely stimulating. Everybody seemed to become great and wise and good in his presence. We walked on the shores of Windermere, climbed Rydal Mount, rode across Lake Grasmere, leaving our names on the visitors' list, and all the time we dwelt upon high Olympus and talked. But alas, Tyndall's vivacity undid me. 2 days of his company, with 2 sleepless nights, and I fled him as I would a pestilence." But Carlyle growled out one thing in Spencer's presence which Spencer often quoted. "If I had my own way," said Carlyle, "I would send the sons of poor men to college, and the sons of rich men I would send to work." Manual labor in right proportion means mental development. Too much hoe may slant the brow, but hoe in proper proportion develops the cerebellum. In the past, we've had one set of men do all the work, and another set had all the culture. One hoes and another thirsts. There are whole areas of brain cells which are evolved only through the efforts of hand and eye, for it is the mind, at last, that directs all our energies. The development of brain and body go together. Manual work is brain work. Too much brain work is just as bad as too much toil. The misuse of the pen carries just as severe a penalty as the misuse of the hoe. And it is great satisfaction to realize that the thinking world has reached a point where these propositions do not have to be proven. There was a time when Spencer regretted that he had not been sent to college, instead of being set to work. But later he came to regard his experience as a practical engineer and surveyor as a very precious and necessary part of his education. John Tyndall and Alfred Russel Wallace had an experience almost identical. In childhood, John attended the village school for 6 months of the year, and the rest of the time helped his parents, as children of poor people do. When 19, he went to work carrying a chain in their surveying corps. Steady attention to the business in hand brought its sure reward. In a few years he had charge of the squad, and was given the duty of making maps and working out complex calculations in engineering. In mathematics he especially excelled. 5 years in the employ of the Irish Ordnance Survey, and 3 years in practical railroad building, and Tyndall got the socialistic bee in his bonnet. He resigned a good position to take part in bringing about the millennium. That he helped the old world along toward the ideal, there is no doubt. But Tyndall is dead and Jerusalem is not yet. When the rule of the barons was broken, and the stage of individualism or competition was ushered in, men said, "Lo, the time is at hand, and now is." But it was not. Socialism is coming by slow degrees, imperceptibly almost as the growing of spring flowers that push their way from the damp, dark earth into the sunlight. And after socialism, what? Perhaps the millennium will still be a long way off. In 1847, when Tyndall was 27 years old, Robert Owen, one of the greatest practical men the world has ever seen, cried aloud, "The time is at hand!" Owen was an enthusiast, all great men are. He had risen from the ranks by the absolute force of great untiring, restless, and loving spirit. From a day laborer in a cotton mill, he had become principal owner of a plant that supported 5,000 people. Owen saw the difference between joyless labor and joyful work. His mills were clean, orderly, sanitary, and surrounded with lawns, trees, and shrubbery. He was the first man in England to establish kindergartens, and this he did at his own expense for the benefit of his helpers. He established libraries, clubs, swimming pools, night schools, lecture courses, and all this time his business prospered. To the average man, it is a miracle how any one individual could bear the heaviest business burdens and still do what Robert Owen did. Robert Owen had vitality plus, he was a gourmet for work. William Morris was just such a man, only with a bias for art, but both Owen and Morris had the intensity and impetus to get the thing done while common folks are thinking about it. Owen was familiar with every detail of his vast business, and he was an expert in finance. Like Napoleon, he said, "The finances? I will arrange them." Robert Owen erected schoolhouses, laid out gardens, built mills, constructed tenements, traveled, lectured, and wrote books. His enthusiasm was contagious. He was never sick. He could not spare the time, and a doctor once said, "If Robert Owen ever dies, it will be through too much Robert Owen." Owen went over to Dublin on one of his tours, and lectured on the ideal life, which to him was socialism, each for all and all for each. Fourier, the dreamer, supplied a good deal of the argument, but Robert Owen did the thing. Socialism always catches these two classes, doers and dreamers, workers and drones, honest men and rogues, those with a desire to give and those with a lust to get. Among others who heard Owen speak at Dublin was the young Irish engineer, John Tyndall. Tyndall was the type of man that must be common before we can have socialism. There was not a lazy hair in his head, ay, not a selfish one either. He had a tender heart, a receptive brain, and the spirit of obedience, the spirit that gives all without counting the cost, the spirit that hearkens to the God within. And need I say that the person who gives all gets all? The economics of God are very simple. We receive only that which we give. The only love we keep is the love we give away. These are very old truths. I did not discover nor invent them. They are not covered by copyright. Cast thy bread upon the waters. John Tyndall was melted by Owen's passionate appeal of each for all and all for each. To live for humanity seemed the one desirable thing. His loving Irish heart was melted. He sought Owen out at his hotel, and they talked till 3 o'clock in the morning. Owen was a judge of men. His success depended upon this one thing, as that of every successful business must. He saw that Tyndall was a rare soul, and nearly fulfilled his definition of a gentleman. Tyndall had hope, faith, and splendid courage, but best of all, he had that hunger for truth which classes him forever among the sacred few. During his work out of doors on surveying trips he had studied the strata, gotten on good terms with birds, bugs, and bees. He knew the flowers and weeds and loved all the animate things of nature, so that he recognized their kinship to himself, and he hesitated to kill or destroy. Education is a matter of desire, and a man like Tyndall is getting an education wherever he is. All is grist that comes to his mill. Robert Owen had but recently started Queenswood College in Hampshire, and nothing would do but Tyndall should go there as a teacher of science. "Is he a skilled and educated teacher?" someone had asked Owen. "Better than that," replied Owen. "He is a regular firebrand of enthusiasm." And so Tyndall resigned his position with the railroad and moved over to England, taking up his home at Harmony Hall. Harmony Hall was a beautiful brick building, with the letters C.M. carved on the cornerstone in recognition of the commencement of the millennium. The pupils were mostly workers in the Owen mills who had shown some special aptitude for education. The pupils and teachers all worked at manual labor a certain number of hours daily. There was a delightful feeling of comradeship about the institution. Tyndall was happy in his work. He gave lectures on everything, and taught the things that no one else could teach, and of course he got more out of the lessons than any of the scholars. But after a few months' experience with the ideal life, Tyndall had common sense enough to see that Harmony Hall, instead of being the spontaneous expression of the people who shared its blessings, was really a charity maintained by one Robert Owen. It was a beneficent autocracy, a sample of one man power, beautifully expressed. Robert Owen planned it, built it, directed it, and made good any financial deficit. Instead of socialism, it was a kindly despotism. A few of the scholars did their level best to help themselves and help the place, but the rest didn't think and didn't care. They were passengers who enjoyed the cushioned seats. A few, while partaking of the privileges of the place, denounced it. "You cannot educate people who do not want to be educated," said Tyndall. "The value of an education lies in the struggle to get it. Do too much for people, and they will do nothing for themselves." Many of the students at Harmony Hall had been sent there by Owen, because he, in the greatness of his heart and the blindness of his zeal, thought they needed education. They may have needed it, but they did not want it. Ease was their aim. The indifference and ingratitude Robert Owen met with did not discourage him. It only gave him an occasional pause. He thought that the bad example of English society was too close to his experiments. It vitiated the atmosphere. So he came over to America and founded the town of New Harmony, Indiana. The fine solid buildings he erected in Posey County, then a wilderness, are still there. As for the most romantic and interesting history of New Harmony, Robert Owen and his socialistic experiments, I must refer the gentle reader to the Encyclopedia Britannica, a work I have found very useful in the course of making my original researches. After a year at Harmony Hall, Tyndall saw that he would have to get out, or else become a victim of arrested development, through too much acceptance of a strong man's bounty. "You cannot afford to accept anything for nothing," he said. Life at Harmony Hall to him was very much like life in a monastery, to which stricken men flee when the old world seems too much for them. When all the people live the ideal life, I'll live it. But until then, I'm only one of a great many strugglers. Besides, he felt that in missing university training, he had dropped something out of his life. Now he would go to Germany and see for himself what he had missed. While railroading, he had saved up nearly £4,000. This money he had offered at one time to invest in shares in the Owen mills. But Robert Owen said, "Wait 2 years and then see how you feel." Robert Owen was not a financial exploiter. Tyndall may have differed with him in a philosophic way, but they never ceased to honor and respect each other. And so John Tyndall bade the ideal life goodbye, and went out into the stress, strife, and struggle, resolved to spend his $2,000 in bettering his education, and then to start life anew. End of section 19.